and this is just coming through right now, but it makes me feel like queer love is a type of hybridity, you know?
Yes.
And like a type of hybridity that happens relationally. In some ways, I feel like all love can be like this, like not just queer love, but I feel like in just speaking from our experience across, like even within non-binary bodies, and then also kind of the cultural differences and hybridities.
Welcome to Bespoken Bones with your host, Pavini Moray, connecting ancestors, sex, magic, and science. Pavini explores transpersonal tools for erotic wellness every new and full moon, engaging educators, healers, spiritual leaders, and scientists in revolutionary dialogue. Get ready to feel good and go deep. This is Bespoken Bones.
Hi, and welcome to Bespoken Bones, Ancestors at the Crossroads of Sex, Magic, and Science. We're in the business of healing trauma, connecting with our roots, and developing radiant erotic wellness in past, present, and future generations. And I'm your host, Pavini Moray. It's been so sweet to receive the messages of connection, of support, the questions you've been sending. I really want to encourage you to reach out and be in touch. I love hearing from you, and often the suggestions of the people you want to hear on the show end up happening. So do definitely reach out. You can do that on bespokenbones.com, the website. It's so cool today to be able to introduce you to my guests, Pinar and So of Queer Nature. Pinar, pronouns they, them, is an indigenous futurist, mentor, consultant, and eco-philosopher, the co-founder of Queer Nature, an organism stewarding earth-based queer community through ancestral skills, interspecies solidarity, and rites of passage. Enchanted by the liminal, Pinar is a neurodivergent NB with Wonka, Turkish, and Chinese lineages. As a QT BIPOC outdoor catalyst, their inspiration is envisioning decolonially informed queer ancestral futurism through interspecies accountability and the remediation of human exceptionalism. Their relationship with queerness, hybridity, neurodivergence, indigeneity, and belonging guided their work in developing queer eco-psychology with a somatic in-depth approach through a decolonial lens. As a survival skills mentor, one of their core missions is to uplift and amplify the brilliant survival skills that BIPOC, LGBTQ, and other intersexual systematically targeted populations already have in their resilient bodies and stories of survivance. So is a white, queer Greek American who grew up in the northern hardwood forests of Alnobak territory, also known as Central Vermont. So worked as a seasonal shepherd throughout college and considers their life path to be deeply inspired, combined resilience and tenderness of cloven-hooved beings who inspired them to study the earth more closely. The soul of So's work in and around nature is animated by studies of identity, place, notions of the sacred, and interspecies relationships within the context of colonization, globalization, migration, and climate change. And so for more information about their work, which we're going to be talking about, you can visit their website, queernature.org. Pinar, and So, it's so lovely to welcome you onto Bespoken Bones.
Thank you so much. We're so grateful to be here.
Yes, and a sweet, warm welcome to all of your people as well. I'd like to start just by talking about your work, and I'm going to read something that you have written about Queer Nature. You write, Queer Nature is an education and social sculpture project based on Arapaho, Ute, and Cheyenne territories that actively dreams into decolonially informed queer ancestral futurism. We're going to talk a little bit about that through mentorship in place-based skills with awareness of post-industrial, globalized, ecocidal contexts. Place-based skills include naturalist studies, handcrafts, survival skills, and recognition of colonial and indigenous histories of land, and are framed in a container that emphasizes deep listening and relationship building with living and non-living earth systems. So yeah, talk to me about your work and what you're up to, and what, we're going to talk a little bit more in a minute about queer ancestral futurism. So really just like, what is the gist of Queer Nature? What are you up to?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it can be good when we talk about what queer nature is or what we do, to kind of start with things that are really up for us right now, and just like what we're currently thinking about in the context of that work, which is a lot of things. But one thing that really comes to mind right now is like this question, this kind of paradox with the idea of belonging and the notion of belonging, and I guess how belonging can also be unsettling. And I think that's a big theme for us right now, is like, while queer nature is really interested in teaching a lot of these and holding space for a lot of these different earth-based and place-based skills as skills of belonging, and feeling like that is actually like a practice and an ongoing practice, and not really an end state, belonging, that is, and really something that emerges from communities and ecosystems and land, kind of, and not even just emerging from one individual. And so something that I think we really dream into and even struggle with is that paradox between holding space for these practices of belonging that are various place-based skills, while also doing work that unsettles as well, and particularly for folks of marginalized and targeted statuses, specifically LGBTQ2 SIA folks. So I think that might be a good place to start. And I'm curious, if Pinar, if you want to add anything to that.
Thank you. Yeah. One thing that really comes to my mind is with queer nature, we often share how we're an organism. And I know that you read that in my bio, and how queer nature is an organism. And that's kind of in like rather than an organization, essentially. And also, acknowledging that we do kind of shapeshift into like an organization, like we can be, functioning as that as well. But really the core of it being an ecology, and in particular an ecology that's actually really rooted in a love story between So and myself, but also with the more than human world and in between our ancestors. So that's something that feels really important to name up front, because sometimes there's this question of, well, what do you do as an organization? And speaking of like, okay, well, what do we do as an organism? And organisms are highly relational within an ecosystem or in communities. And I would say that we're pretty responsive in that way, or we at least attempt to be, or like hold that prayer to be responsive in that way. And a lot of what I would say that we do together is creating conditions or creating a space to co-create queer ancestral futurism, like dreaming into what does it mean, to be queer, and what does it mean to also connect to place, the more than human world, and our ecological kin, in particular within the context of climate chaos. And again, this can look, on the surface level, like teaching wildlife tracking, teaching basket making and survival skills. And those are such incredible portals for like that conversation, that co-creative conversation, not only between humans, which are such incredible people and beings in this world, but also across species. And so that feels like a really important piece to say, not again, like the love story piece, and also like a love for community, love for the human community, but also our ecological community, and how do we respond to our times right now?
Thank you. Yeah, these are thoughts that I'm very much aligned with and am thinking a lot about, and want to touch in with you, especially this thing where I want to go first with it is this idea about belonging as a practice. It's also what I believe. And it's interesting, right? Because queer is like, in how I hold queer, it's the essence of an outsider identity, right? And we're coming together and trying to figure out how we belong to each other, how we belong to the planet. And yet there's an embodied narrative of otherness right? And so my sense is that shows up in our communities as friction, as lack of, like, we can't trust, right? We don't trust that we're safe. We don't trust that we belong. And it's my sense also that we don't actually know, most of us don't actually know what it really feels like on the embodied, like, sensation level to belong, right? And that it's not a constant state of like, oh, I just belong and that's it, full stop, right? So I'm curious of, what you want to say about these practices of belonging. How does someone practice the felt sense of belonging, so it's kind of on the individual level and on the community level? How do we practice belonging to our communities?
Yeah, I love this inquiry. And I just really want to honor I think the struggles and the wound of belonging that I feel like our whole culture is struggling with right now. And then queer folks and folks of different targeted statuses, especially as the sensitive folks we often are like struggling with our own kind of maybe even amplified sort of fractal version of that. And I just honor that. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to just, to dream into, moving through that and with both of you. And I mean, to me, I think that belonging is like, especially for me coming from the position of a white person of settler descent, like, I feel like for me, I've had to do some unlearning around like belonging isn't actually about like, owning land or even actually being in one place. Because I mean, there's so many of our kin, human and other than, who migrate, and there's so much intelligence in that. And belonging is, I think, one thing we've been thinking about lately is like kind of about being embedded within webs of accountability with other beings, human and non-human beings, in ways that cultivate resilience within a community and basically increase our community's ability to like resist disempowerment and to resist systemic oppression. And I feel like, some of the practices that immediately come to mind around this are, I mean, number one is just deep listening, witness, observing and tracking relationships, and for us in queer nature, that often looks like in the more than human world. And one thing we interrogate a lot with queer nature is kind of interrogating the Western science lens of naturalist studies that often really wants to push us to like name things. Like you especially see this in birding communities. And I also like love discovering the different names of birds as well. So there's so much intelligence in naming, and I'm not trying to, shut that down in any way. But I think for folks who've been culturally and emotionally really pushed out and excluded from a lot of sort of outdoorsy spaces, and rural, and like made to feel unsafe in rural spaces and hunting cultures, certainly in the military, and in a lot of these spaces, I think that it can be really freeing to actually realize that to really learn and to apprentice to these practices of belonging, the number one thing you have to do is just witness and listen and see what relationships you can observe, and not put as much weight on naming things at least initially. Because I think one thing that a lot of people in the nature connection community talk about when you first start getting into like tracking and naturalist studies and nature connection and botany and herbalism, you go outside and you kind of see like this wall of green and everything kind of looks the same. And it's overwhelming. And part of that, I think, is that our culture and sort of Western scientific culture wants to atomize everything and categorize everything and name everything. And then there's this much more ancient kind of process-based way of seeing things that is so much based on relationship. And that knowledge can only unfold through time and through like dirt time. And then the other thing I would mention that kind of goes into this is like basically seeing power and privilege as part of ecology. This is another way that we interrogate the kind of naturalist community and the separation of quote unquote natural history from human history. Really just interrogating one's own impact and in the ecosystem as well as in the social system, and just building relationship of respect with other species, but also with other cultures, with other peoples across difference. And I would say to all of those skills, before I hand it off to Pinar too, because I know there's so much richness that they will share, but that all of these skills are actually just awareness skills and really like situational awareness and assessment skills and skills around really like, yeah, just awareness. And I think that just for me as a queer person who also struggles with a lot of anxiety and a lot of trauma and basically PTSD from political terror at this point, I think that our awareness can often get so tiny, and that's a survival strategy. And and really to kind of utilize and lean on the abundance of our more than human kin and world as like this kind of lab where we can practice expanding that awareness out again. So I think that's where I'll stop. If there's anything either of you want to add.
Yeah, just thank you for that. Really beautiful. And I just want to highlight one thing that I caught. You said it really quick, but I think I heard you say dirt time.
Yes. Yeah.
I love it.
Totally. Yeah. Dirt time. Exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would say, thank you so much so for what you shared. A lot of rich territory that you moved us all through. I feel like one thing that feels like that comes up for me in terms of practices of belonging is kind of my personal story, a part of my personal story, which is I am a suicide survivor. And for me, as someone who actually was clinically dead for when I was 14, so it was a little over half of my life ago, or maybe the beginning of my life in some ways. I feel like as someone who is a suicide survivor, but also who's someone who's neurodivergent in multiple ways, including someone who experiences parallel realities, that was pretty pathologized as a teen or as a young person. Belonging is a topic that's really rich and like tender and beautiful from just like witnessing and myself as someone as a teen who really struggled, like as a trans teen who didn't see myself often reflected in the human world. And one of the things that, and with the narrative, like really going through the narrative that I didn't belong and that I, did not exist as like a mixed Indigenous person and as a trans person. And as someone whose realities were deeply questioned and pathologized. And one of the ways that I actually really started to build relationship back to myself and to my power was actually deeply through my relationship with my ancestors at the time. And I didn't have that language at the time, but and at the same time, I kind of did, but I would say it's been a lot more fleshed out. But to me, I feel like I just am so grateful for the more than human community and my ancestors who were incredibly generous enough to really initiate me into the practices of belonging, especially as someone, again, who was really was fighting like a systemic narrative that I did not belong and that I did not exist and that I was invisibilized in many ways. And I grew up in Turkey, but I also grew up additionally in the Ohlone territory in the Bay Area. And I just really want to acknowledge the land there, that really, and the ancestors of the place there as these an incredible resilient community that really initiated me to really practice these skills of belonging. And at first it looked like sitting outside. I still do that. I just sit outside and just, sat with the trees. It was the only way that I could really calm my nervous system down, actually, as a teenager that struggled with panic attacks. And that's something that I just feel like is really, there's a lot of innate wisdom that I feel like our bodies carry, and that I feel like many listeners may also really relate to, of like, wow, like I've already potentially begun this conversation and practices of belonging just by listening to what my nervous system and what my body needs and in relationship with the more than human world. And so I just really wanted to share that as well. That just felt really important to me to also bring it back to like, being like essentially my youth, and and just that experience of not belonging, and the invitation and the availability to really be in relationship to place.
Yeah. One thing that this is so speaking again, that just to add on to that, because I feel like some listeners, like queer and folks of different marginal statuses, might appreciate this, is like another thing that's really been medicine for both of us is connecting with the creatures that have been othered, the other than human creatures in our society, and particularly in colonial society, that get demonized and othered, but also that represent brilliant survival strategies. And in the cities, some of those creatures are pigeons, who are basically feral rock doves who carry this amazing ancestral story of one of the first creatures who basically domesticated us, I like to say, but who were domesticated and who were these huge allies of many of our ancient communities and ancestral communities, and now are basically treated with such disrespect by so many people. And the squirrels and the crows and the rats, the ravens, and these coyotes, and these creatures are some of our guides and some of our deepest guides, because we feel such a deep solidarity with them. And another kind of theme that gets into is hybridity, like even talking about the coyotes now on the eastern seaboard of the so-called United States, who have been shown to be basically hybrids with eastern wolves, and also incredibly new to that ecosystem. They've only really been there since the 1940s, because their traditional territories are actually the west coast of Turtle Island. And these creatures are incredibly demonized right now in our culture. They're basically the new big bad wolf of East Coast ecologies. And there's something that both Pinar and I track, and that really came through when we met and in our love story, about us both being hybrids and both identifying kind of as third culture kids. That said, and with also the difference of me being white and Pinar being a person of color, and then also that difference too. And wondering and being curious about the connection between queerness and hybridity, and hybridity basically being this coming together of difference that often in the natural world, like some scientists will really speak disparagingly of hybridity. For example, there's this recent case of a warbler, a type of bird that was found to be a hybrid of 3 different species somehow. And a lot of some of the scientists who wrote about it were like, oh, this is obviously these birds' parents were making the best of a bad situation, because there just weren't that many options for mates where they were living. And I thought that was so funny, because I was like, wow, it's so interesting that negative tone and that negative valencing of hybridity, because, I think there's fewer of them, but other, biologists, particularly who study the eastern coyote, are actually arguing that hybridity could kind of be seen as like an emergent strategy of the ecosystem to respond to rupture and basically ecological fracture that's being created in climate chaos. And so what about that, bringing that lens into queerness and hybridity? And because for us, I think our queerness is inextricable from our cultural identities and our third culture identities of having grown up in different cultures from the US as well as the US, and just being curious about that. And I think I'll just leave it at that, because I feel like either of you might have a rabbit hole to go down from there. But
I feel so excited hearing you speak about this. It's my sense too, right? And I'm thinking of a picture that I saw this year that was a cardinal that was the coloration was 1/2 female and 1/2 male. Did you see that picture?
Yes. Totally.
And it's my magical sense that trans folks are that recently there's been such a, I don't want to say influx, because that's not the right word, but just like a heightened visibility of the gender blessed, right? That there's suddenly it's like, oh wow, we're a movement, right? There's less isolation, and it's my sense that it's medicinal, right? That it's like, oh, when there's an ecosystem that is in jeopardy, is in danger, is creating harm, that this is a potential medicine that happens, right? It's not only the survival strategy for that. I guess it's like maybe a survival strategy for the species, but it's like there's this this burgeoning of this hybridity that you're speaking of. And I know, Pinar, you talked a little bit about the third gender folks who are in your lineage, and I just wonder if, like, how do you all respond to that?
Did you want me to, would it help to share a little bit more context around around Kwari-Warmi, the third gender lineage? Great.
That would
as
be
you were
amazing.
speaking to that, Pavini, I was just like, around like more visibility around the our gender blessed communities, and how it could be a partly a response to something going on, in our world right now, in our cultures. Just like visibility and more solidarity in that, and a movement. It really reminded me a lot of my Kwari-Warmi lineage, which is my Andean third gender lineage, that I want to share a little bit about, because I think it actually is incredible, the way that it fits into what we're talking about, and it makes me really excited. But yeah, essentially, and this is something I've recently found out about, like, I think like maybe 4 years ago at this point, where and that's its own story of coming to learn, and, decolonizing my own gender, and just really having deep inquiry as to, like, my entire life not feeling super like in alignment with a ton of the LGBTQ community, especially, I guess, like in Ohlone territory, where I grew up, like in the San Francisco area, which was about like 15 years ago. I just didn't necessarily feel a ton of, like, I didn't feel like I was reflected in that. Not that I was, like, I was really excited about the movements going on, but I also didn't feel reflected. And so my way of kind of exploring my gender and sexuality was going out into the natural world, and really feeling deeply reflected around my sexuality and gender there, and my queerness. And as I've been trying to do, like, several years ago, doing research for on my ancestral lineages, I came across this book called Decolonizing the Sodomite. And it's by a person named Michael Horswell, who is a white academic. And I believe he does a lot of research around, like, just like third genders in the Andes. And so I came across this book that I was just like so enthralled by. And it was just this, like, and maybe some of you who are listening might be able to relate to this, of like finding a gem, like this, like, connection and portal to our ancestral lineage, within the context of, severance from our lineages, and how painful that is, but also like the gift of finding these, like, portals and these connections, not only through our ancestral connections and practices that we have, but maybe even in, like, the middle world, or like the everyday world, where we find these, like, these portals. And so the piece that I want to share around the Kwari-Warmi is, within Andean cosmology, there's something called a Pachacuti, which is called, essentially translates to a cataclysmic change. So a cataclysmic change to the culture as we know it, essentially. And Pachacutis are now seen as kind of just like these, kind of like a cycle within culture. And one example of a Pachacuti is actually what happened in 1492, with, like, the settlers coming in, and that cataclysmically changed our culture as we know it. And that's something we're still moving through. But the origin story of the Kwari-Warmi people is essentially during the first Pachacuti. There was this, essentially, this, like, this terror, this sheer, like, terror of, like, unknowing, and this, like, oh my gosh, like, our culture is going to change, and we don't know how to move through this, like, unknown, and just this, like, deep unknown and anxiety that the whole communities and entire communities faced. And And in this, there was a jaguar deity that's called Chin Chui Chin Chai, which is a golden jaguar, and also a rainbow jaguar, a bit of both. That's dual gendered. And they're a mountain deity. And mountain deities are, the mountains themselves are referred to as apus. And this jaguar deity essentially invoked Kwari Warmis. And this was Kwari Warmis, the third gender people, and continue to be. And there are people who walk in the liminal space. And they are people essentially who walk between, what we call masculine and feminine, and death and birth. And were these medicine people and continue to be these people who ended up holding the stories of our culture and continue to hold the stories and would perform ceremony that would tell the stories of our culture. And they were invoked in part because we're so familiar with liminality and in-betweenness. That was essentially the call was to support our culture in the Pachacuti, the first Pachacuti, because we're so, familiar and versed in the unknown and in mystery and in betweenness and liminality, that we would be act essentially as like midwives as well as death doulas to a culture that's shifting and essentially transforming, of how to like shepherd in between the unknown. And so that's a bit about the origin story of the Kwari Warmi, and it feels so pertinent to our time right now, especially within climate chaos and this unknowing of our species, like whether we're going to exist in a century or not, with everything that's happening in our world. And that's something that I just feel like is so alive for me when we talk about like gender blessed or gender expansive people and the gift of liminality, and like what is like what are the gifts that we can actually really step into and own as community members to this ecological community that we live in, or Pachamama. And that's something that I just feel like is so up for us, and this inquiry around what is our ecological role as people who are in-betweeners. And it looks differently depending on like our own ancestral lineage and like our own ancestrally informed genders as well, if you have access to that, which to some I know it's hard to find access to. But that feels just like something that is a huge part of the inquiry that we're living into right now.
So gorgeous. It's yes. The connection, I do want to speak about your love story, but I just want to quickly weave this connection between disbelonging, belonging, gender blessing, ecological crisis, right? That there's like, I just also wonder if there's something like, yes, we have to practice belonging as an embodied practice, right? And of learning to do that in a way that both is and is not place-based. And I love that you talk about the unsettling as well as the settling, right? The settling into our bodies, the settling into the sensations of that. And it's like, what is the magic of disbelonging, right? The which I think I really hear you speaking to, of like and I just feel like I was dancing with some trans women of color who are imprisoned recently, and that was the thing. I was like, oh my God, holy shit, this is so powerful. Like this, it's palpable, the power, right? And it's like, how do we just freaking remember that? How do we just remember that that's what it actually is, right? It's not this thing that has been put on us, right? That's a lie. And it's like, if we can, the image that I'm getting is just kind of like sweeping away that lie to the actual remembrance of like, wait, this is the true thing. What you just said is the true thing. Yeah. Would you talk to me about your love story? I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, definitely. Well, yeah, I feel like it's a long story, but I want to like respect our time together. So I'm trying to find where to begin. And I think, part of it began when I was in grad school in Southern California, and was really feeling a bit disenchanted, I think, with academia, or not necessarily, because I really do identify as like a scholar and an historian and just like a total like queer literary nerd. But I also really had this, like, just coming back to this notion of hybridity. I've always had this really deep theme in my life of, like, in addition to being non-binary and walking between and within the worlds of different genders, like just walking within worlds in kind of the vocational realm as well, and feeling like, ever since I was young, like having this really deep connection to the natural world, really as a place of mystery, and really that like something that helped me affirm that that it's okay to not know. Because I think for me, growing up in a small, New England, so-called New England town, there weren't any queer people around. There weren't any gender blessed people visible that I could see. Maybe there were, but they weren't out. And so, for me, there was this weaving together of the other than human world and my connection with nature, and sort of mysticism and spirituality, actually, because that, I feel like the other than human world was really the place where where mystery and the unknown was okay. And then the other place that was okay was, the ancient mystical traditions, from, the Persian mystics to like the medieval Christian mystics, all the people who in our histories and also in my ancestry have written these love songs and love poems to the unknown. And so that is kind of what led to me going to grad school and studying religious studies, and in my case, the history of Christianity. And I found myself at this place after school where I was like, I really want to combine this work of history and storytelling and trying to heal these wounds around Western imagination and the ability of us as people of European descent to kind of imagine the future and connect with our ancestors in these ways. And so I just felt this call to like go back or go and explore the world of kind of outdoor education and nature connection. And I didn't really know how it was all going to unfold, but I was looking at this at a program at the school up in Washington State that is like a year-long program for adults in nature connection and basically nature-based mentorship. So in addition to just kind of wilderness skills and outdoor skills, their mission is kind of to teach people how to be mentors in a nature-based context. And for me, coming from the world of academia where you're never really taught how to teach, was like really like super exciting. And so this is kind of a long buildup, but it will make sense in a minute. Because when I was in the process of looking at this school, I ended up running across Pinar's bio on their website, because Pinar was a current student at this year-long intensive. And in Pinar's bio, I was really struck by it. And I like the first or second line of their bio, like included, like, I identify as genderqueer. And this is what that means. And these are my ancestors. And I also have this deep connection to shepherding and to sheep. And in that moment, there was just this like really intense, like lightning bolt of synchronicity, because shepherding and sheep are actually how I got into nature connection and earth-based skills and like survival skills, because of my work as a seasonal shepherd throughout college, which was at the time a way for me to connect. The only way I could really figure for me to connect with my Greek ancestry and my matrilineal lands, because I had such a deep nostalgia for them. And so at that moment, I was like, wow, this is like a sign or something. And I ended up applying to that program, and then kind of forgot about that flash of synchronicity in some ways, because like I, met a lot of other people related to this school, and it kind of slipped my mind. And then when I was visiting this town where the school was in near Seattle in Washington, I actually ended up running into Pinar in this town just totally by happenstance. And we actually I was driving a rental car, and I parked the car in what was at that time a very random parking lot that I then came to know very well the following year, because it was where I lived. But at the time, it was random. And I parked in this parking spot, and Pinar's car was parked right next to mine, but their car was parked backwards, because Pinar always likes to park backwards so that they can have a quick escape route. And because of that, our driver's side doors opened into each other, and I opened my door, and I was trying to get out, and Pinar was trying to get into their car, and neither of us could get out or get in. And in that moment, we were given like the opportunity to encounter each other, and it was like this, like, whoa, like, who are you? And in that moment, I recognized them from the website, and I was like, oh, are you involved with this wilderness school? And Pinar was like, well, yes, I am. How did you know? And then I immediately was like, oh, I read your bio, and I love what you said about shepherding. And, I worked as a shepherd too. And that's like a deep part of my identity. And we immediately just started talking about our ancestors. And then that conversation was really how we met. And I don't know, I want to hand it off to you, Pinar, too, because I feel like I often tell the beginning of the story and then Pinar picks it up.
Yeah, I just remember so deeply that when we met, there was just such deep recognition. Like it was actually really shocking for my nervous system, in a good way, but also in an overwhelming way. I was pretty overjoyed, and we spent like the next several hours walking in town together and just spending time talking about queerness and mysticism and nature and how those converge for both of us in different ways. And, we kept in touch. We were like, oh, like I have to go. And so was mentioning that they have to go to their friend's house in Seattle, and but let's keep in touch. And that summer, so ended up going to a monastery in Greece. And I was still in Duwamish territory, so-called Seattle area. And yeah, essentially we just kept in touch. And I remember telling So, like, wave across the Aegean Sea for me, and wave to, my ancestral homes, because I grew up on the Aegean coast, and where I could actually see Greece. I could see Samos Island, and just such a deep place of connection. And yeah, and I just remember this like really beautiful like opening that happened. And after we hung out the first time, that encounter we had, I remember driving home up to this little cabin of mine, and I actually had to pull over like within minutes of driving, and just pull over to the side. And I started to like my body was shaking so hard that I couldn't drive, and I ended up what I call crafter, which is like crying and laughing at the same time. Like I just had this like experience of like, oh my God, like who's this person? And this soul encounter that just happened, and like our ancestors meeting, and this synchronicity, and just this incredible like portal that opened in our meeting, and this like budding ecology essentially that then later really informed the work that we do like so much.
Yeah, queer nature is like our baby.
Yeah,
like one of them.
One of our like queer babies. So and there's so much more to the story too, of like, I that involved me getting all camouflaged and like hiding in the woods and waiting for So to come back to like the area, which I know sounds kind of interesting without much context.
Like they were getting me back at like when I we call it compassionate creeping, because we actually at Queer Nature, we are really passionate about stealth skills and like camouflage and evasion and doing that as queer people. And like, what is the magic of choosing to be invisible when we're so often invisibilized? And we're queer people are also so good at tracking energies and awareness that like it's just something we're super passionate about. And so that was definitely a thread when we met, where like I had sort of stumbled across them digitally, and then when we met in person, I happened to know I had sort of incidentally done this recon on them and happened to know about them, which was kind of, I think, surprising. And then when I ended up moving up there the following fall, and I literally was driving to the place that I was renting, and Pinar was actually like hiding in the woods nearby waiting for me. But we also, there was an understanding that it was completely consensual too. It was like very consensual, like creeping or something. And like also just a deep kind of more than human eros and practice around belonging, and like how to like just belonging with how do these practices of like getting all camouflaged allow us to like really erotically connect to nature. And we sort of had that understanding, which is also really remarkable, that was just there, that resonance was there, and we totally played with it, and it was really strange.
It was like a beautiful
hilarious.
like, I would say that trickster definitely came out in our falling in love, and like neither of us, or I didn't imagine myself ever getting married, and but the fact that we're like queering tradition, because we both come from pretty traditional backgrounds, like at least so is Greek ancestry and my Turkish as well as Andean ancestry. Like there was something kind of trickstery too, and like about like our marriage and like wanting to queer tradition, and again with the blessing of like our ancestors, and definitely some of them were a little rolling around like in their graves a little about you know, Greek,
especially with the Greek and Turkish thing.
But yeah, I feel like we've done a lot of ancestral healing work between our ancestors and with our love, and also with the liminal space that we hold with our gender and our different identities.
I love the crafter. I love it so much. It's, you know, for me, that's how I know God is present. Like that's how I feel
that's
God.
beautiful.
It's like, oh, crafter, right? Like the is it grief or is it joy? Is it ecstasy? You know, it's all at the same time, right? And you know, it's the irony that you're speaking of, like the consensual creeping, and like, oh, queers are really good, right? Because we're fucking hyper vigilant because trauma, right? But like, what a gift to have these sensitivities. And I speak about that a lot, like the hidden blessings of trauma. And I love that it shows up here in y'all's relationship and in the work that you're doing. And I love also the role of wildness that I hear. It hasn't been named explicitly, but I hear this feral love, right? Where you're like sneaking around in the woods to find each other, and you're like, you know, waving to each other's ancestors across the sea. And like, there's this quality of like, I will not be contained. I will not be confined. This love is so much bigger than any political oppression or any political state can create. This love is so much bigger than that, and we will not be prevented from this. Right? We will have this fierceness and the determination of your love.
Thank you for
gorgeous.
Witnessing.
It's like, yeah, and if I get it. It's like when there is love like this in the world, and when we can talk about it and we can name it, and you know, not to idealize it at all, but like it does change things. It's like, oh, this is what's possible, right? This, like, oh, okay, cool. We have this, like, the complexity of both oppression and privilege in our ancestral lines, right? We have like the ways, and we're having to hold the complexity of all that. But hey, look, guys, we're doing it, right? And we're doing it with like this incredible vision and this incredible like a sense of what becomes possible. It's like the new humanity.
Yeah, totally. Well, it reminds me too that, I mean, and this is just coming through right now, but it makes me feel like queer love is a type of hybridity, you know?
Yes.
And like a type of hybridity that happens relationally. In some ways, I feel like all love can be like this, like not just queer love, but I feel like in just speaking from our experience across, like even within non-binary bodies, and then also kind of the cultural differences and hybridities. And there's a way in which it is a type of hybridity that I feel like can open. Because there's something that I've also, both of us have also been kind of stewing on lately, where there's kind of some philosophers now, including the late Mark Fisher, who's a British guy who's now an ancestor actually, and he talked a lot about how neoliberal culture is experiencing a crisis of imagination and is actually unable to envision a future anymore. And there's kind of like for the last several decades, like in science fiction movies, like our vision of the future, like at least in the dominant culture, hasn't really changed. And it's kind of like there's this recycling of kind of retrofuturism happening, which I actually think is brilliant. I think he was a little more grumpy about it, and more critical about it. But I think what we've really taken from that, and what I feel like is a theme in our love and our co-visionary partnership and our work, is that actually, like, when I encountered that work, I was like, you know what? I actually don't feel like a privation of imagination as like a queer non-binary person in this ecology. Like, I actually feel like a lot of the folks on the margins, whether they're queer or disabled or whatever marginal status they're experiencing, I actually feel like when this kind of dominant cis heteropatriarchal neoliberal culture, as they lose the ability to imagine the future, like I actually feel like those on the margins gain the ability to imagine the future, because we've been suffocated. Like our future has been suffocated by this. And now, you know, for better or worse, the fact that a lot of dominant culture has kind of become, there's like this impotence, you know, and I say that with respect to, and not in a disparaging way, but there's this kind of impotence in learning how to conjure the dimension of the future. And there's this way in which I see a lot of our targeted and marginalized communities actually were able to, and that there's actually this paradox where we actually are used to not having a future. So therefore we're able to imagine one, like for ourselves, because we've already been through the despair. We've been through the fear of not having an identity, not seeing anyone like us. Like we've been through, as Pinar mentions, some folks have survived suicide, you know, and so in some ways we know how we're able to envision a queer, strange, different future because we're used to being told we don't have one, you know. And I think that that's something I just also wanted to throw in there.
Another superpower of the queers.
Yeah.
I want to ask if it's okay. I have a kind of a curveball question that I'd love to ask, and you know, you can feel free to pass on.
Sure. Yeah, go for it.
So I've been sitting with this question about, I have a friend who experiences chronic illness and disability, and is expressing so much isolation and loneliness. And this is a person who's like super skillful at community building, right? And it just like, there's something that seems so off to me about that, you know, that this brilliant, imaginative, creative, resourceful, resilient, soulful human is faced with this lack of welcome. And so as part of my research, about what is and this is going back to the queer futurism question of, you know, what does it actually look like in practice? And I'm just curious if you, and maybe this is like really asking this question for you to both be like dropped in on the spirit level, on the body level as you answer it. You know, where in the natural world, where things are thriving, where things are working, where ecosystems are intact and lifeways are intact, where do we have models of care that are different? And maybe it's like in a beehive, or it's in a wolf den, or like, where do we see that the gifts of someone who is differently abled, whatever that species or being is, are actually woven in and celebrated? Can you just think about that in terms of like the ecology of the natural world? Are there examples that come to mind? Because my sense is that there's this bullshit about survival of the fittest, like that's a fucking bullshit notion, and it's a capitalist notion, and like that's not actually true. And I just am asking of like, you know, because it's my sense that like, for example, if a tree is sick, other trees will send medicine or you know, send support. And I just, what would you say to that? Like, how do we find that in the natural world, or where do we see it?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And your friend sounds incredible. I'm also a spoonie. I don't know if people are familiar with that term, but that's a term used by the disability or disabled communities of folks who struggle with or I guess survive with like chronic illness, chronic pain. Also, it can be under neurodivergence as well. But I just wanted to, I really love that question so much because I've been sitting with that for myself quite often. And yeah, and it actually reminds me of this brilliant book that So gifted me a few months ago. That's called Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice by Leah Lakshmi, that I've been reading, and it's been giving me so much nourishment. Leah is a queer person of color. And one of the things that comes up for me, because I know as I've been doing a lot of like sitting and, walking on the land and just like really inquiring about disability justice. And I feel like that's still an ongoing conversation for me of like, okay, like going out specifically with that prayer or that intention on the land of like, I really am sitting and grappling with what disability justice, like they're just sitting with that intention of just like, what does that look like? And I think that there's so many ways that people have co-created and co-envisioned it, but I also really want like the natural world to continually inform me in that. And one of the things that that comes up for me that you were just sharing, Pavini, similar with the trees, like you were saying, it is true that a lot of trees will, there's a mycelial network underground, and mycelial meaning connected to mushrooms. And like the mycelial network, there's a huge mycelial network underground that actually is, they actually transfer nutrients from one tree to another. And they can do that. And it is, from what I understand, there's like, they give trees that are struggling nutrients and kind of redistribute resources in this really beautiful communal way. So if a tree is, really struggling with potentially like some kind of bug problem or just like malnourished in some way, they will, redistribute like resources to that community member. And another thing that comes up for me, and I guess the thunder just rolled in.
Yeah,
that's
wow,
wonderful.
That was the first thunder of the year that we just heard. I just want to name that right now.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I also read or actually listened to the book, I think it's called The Secret Life of Trees. And in that book, he also, the author talks about this phenomena that happens that's so beautiful. And what's interesting is one of the things that he was sharing is that sometimes there are trees that are cut, like pretty much like are felled. And so they pretty much just look like a stump. And essentially the forest floor and the mycelial network and the tree communities will actually continue to support and keep that being alive, which like blows my mind. I'm just like, oh my gosh, like how do we as humans like redistribute energy to people who are like who experience like, energy, getting energies in a different way, like maybe like not having as much energy in this like really this ableist world that is really, just like not created, essentially invisibilizes and pushes out disabled and differently abled folks. So that's a big inquiry of mine as well. And I think, I don't know if you wanted to add anything. So
yeah,
about that.
It's interesting. I mean, this is like, I really appreciate this question. And I wish we had like more time to just like sit around a fire all together and weave stories through this question. And because I feel like it's been really up for me also lately, like just even on some of our recent wanders. And yeah, I wanders outside and trailing and following trails and seeing creatures, tracks and sign. And I think that one thing that has been coming up for me, especially as I delve more and more into tracking and like to the level of like understanding creatures like foot morphologies and like how that translates to their track on the ground. And as I attune myself to higher and higher levels of detail in that really deep awareness practice, I have started to see how different the feet of many creatures look that are even within the same species. And recently we were both on having some really much needed contemplative time out on the land in southwestern Colorado on Ute and on Pueblo territory. And there was a mountain lion whose territory we were in, and we were practically in her living room. And I'm pretty sure that she was a she, because we've since heard stories that there may be a denning happening in that area. And her tracks were pretty much ubiquitous in this area that we were camping. And one of her toes, I think, was broken because it was like really long and kind of much longer than usual than her other toes. And anyway, it was just like, it was really humbling to follow her tracks and to really and also to realize that actually, like, you know, every track of every non-human being within the same species looks different, because they're all individuals and they all have these different aspects of themselves. And then also now to hear that this lion is what I discerned from the tracks was an older female lion, probably a matriarch, who's just been through a lot and you know, is surviving. And there was something, and I don't have a conclusion, because I also, as like an able-bodied person, I don't want to necessarily impose a meaning on it, but I just feel like for both of us, trailing her, respectfully trailing her, with her like different foot, different paw, was like so humbling. And then the other thing that comes to mind is that Leah, who's the author of Care Work, talks a lot about community care and like expanding the notion of self-care to also be like what about community care and what ways. And I feel like that's such an ecological concept, and I love it. And one of the ways that shows up in the other than human world is beavers, who were almost pretty much extirpated from their traditional ranges during colonization and the process of fur trapping, and are now making a big comeback in a lot of places. Thank goodness. And they're these amazing terraformers and healers of land, especially with water and with damming and that process. And on another level, when they build their lodges in the winter, biologists who study them have now found out that they actually share their lodges in the winter with many other beings, because their lodges in these boreal northern climates, and these winter climates, are often some of the warmest places. And where it's kept above freezing in there, and there's basically, they tolerate other species in their lodges throughout the whole winter. And so, some of those species are muskrats, or these are their English names. And I also acknowledge that they all have first names that I don't necessarily know all of them, but muskrats and frogs and little mice and rats. And when we found that out, we were just like so obsessed with it. And we actually refer to our house as the Beaver Lodge now, because we just like love like how communal beavers are, and how much they share and give to others in need in their communities. And it's just something we're living into as well. I would say.
What's beautiful about the Beaver Lodge is like the beavers, like there's a respect of different like abilities involved for me, because it's just incredible that beavers are just like, again, just these incredible beings, and so are mice and rats and frogs, the other beings, and muskrats that inhabit their home, that are invited to their home. And oftentimes frogs actually, they'll during wintertime, they'll actually go under like a deep like mud essentially, and also like leaves, and they'll freeze and hibernate over winter, which is kind of sci-fi to me.
Like it's almost like they become like temporary ancestors or something. Yeah. Like they really go into
cryogenetics.
Yeah, they go into stasis.
And what's really beautiful to me is like the Beaver Lodge is like open to them to be like, okay, like you have an incredible ability to, survive, and like you're welcome to be here too if you want to be warm and, live in another way. So, or, I just feel like that's something that's just so beautiful to me. And there are also other animals such as the painted wolves that live in these packs that, when they have an injured member in their pack, they'll essentially take care of them and feed them and bring them food, won't necessarily ask them to go hunting, even though they'll do other kind of things they'll recon, keep an eye and be aware of the community's safety while they're healing, which I think is so incredible. Yeah. That to me is just, and that's also seen in wolf packs too, on Turtle Island, is when there's an older, an elder essentially in the community who has, either has worn down teeth or a broken jaw or something. There will be beings who actually pack members that will actually chew food for them or bring them food, which I think is just there's so many incredible examples of community care in this in our world. And I think there's also, they're not as uplifted because of who actually studies, whose science is uplifted and studied. And I think that narrative of survival of the fittest is as you said, is incredibly colonial and I think is oftentimes really uplifted in the science narrative. So I just wanted to echo that too.
Yeah, and also just to kind of piggyback onto what Pinar is sharing about the roles of the folks and the beings who aren't as mobile is when we teach classes on sort of what we call stealthcraft, which has also been called scouting, but we don't use that term as much because it can have sort of colonialist associations. But just the practices of reducing our impact when we're out in the natural world, and camouflage and concealment, and sneaking around and meeting our survival needs without being detected, and as a form of protecting ourselves. And and when folks have come to those classes with different abilities, one thing that has really emerged from our collective dreaming into with our community of these spaces is those folks are the ones who are the sentinels. Those folks are, and I mean, I'm not saying this as a proscription or trying to force someone into this box, but this is what I've seen emerge is those folks are the kind of recon scouts and the sentinels, or they're the ones who stay in a central place and gather information, kind of I just imagine this archetype of an elder healer who lives on the edge of a village and kind of sits in their one place, and people come to them, and they connect people, and they gather information. We've had these amazing examples of people in some of our classes when we have these big elaborate treasure hunt kind of scout missions at night or something, and people with different abilities will actually will invite folks to dream into different ecological roles that they could have. And it actually has ended up being that without those people, the mission wouldn't have been accomplished. And I mean, you see this in the bird world too. And this is a big thing in bird language, which is sort of a more decolonial way of talking about ornithology, and it's more focused on interspecies communication. But there's certain species of birds that will often post up as sentinels on tops of trees when there's an aerial predator nearby, and those birds will be stone still, like a statue, and that's actually how you can tell that they're sentineling. And just the body language of those birds will alert all the other birds within several hundred meters, because birds have amazing eyesight usually, that there's a threat. So I guess I just wanted to offer that because I'm hoping that it can be a medicine, or at least some doorway for our kin who do have those questions and come and walk through the world with different abilities than is represented in dominant culture.
Yeah, thank you so much for the depth with which you answer the question. I think I heard something coming through our queer ancestors as you were talking. I was like, oh, you know what you guys are doing? You're redefining queer cruising.
That's awesome.
Right? It's the new queer cruising of these. It's the same skill set.
Yeah.
that queers have used. Yeah. I really want to just say so much thanks and appreciation for the work that you're doing in the world. I hope that I have the chance to study with you at some point, and really for the sharing today. I know that you all have, you're planning a nature-based rite of passage for non-binary folks sometime in 2020. So really want to turn folks onto that. You have an amazing website, which is queernature.org, where you have all of the offerings and things that you're doing are available there, so people can find you there. And just really, just a deep bow of gratitude to you both for all that you bring and all that you're doing, and to your people as well. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And likewise, we both, like, your podcast has been such like medicine for both of us. And I just feel like it's part of the work of kind of what I like to call mythological remediation or something, which is sort of like an equivalent of ecological remediation, and just the work that you do through story, and also through the collaborative story that is an interview. And so I guess I just wanted to say, like, take this opportunity to say how much we appreciate your work, and like, and we actually are going to be probably relocating to the Pacific Northwest this coming year, possibly temporarily, but it's actually all kind of up in the air because a lot kind of got unsettled when our dog Altai passed away 3 months ago, just because she was actually part of Queer Nature and a co-founder, and so a lot has been unsettled, but I think in productive ways. And so that's one reason we don't have a ton of offerings scheduled into next year. But if you want to find out more about the non-binary fast that we're planning with one of our colleagues, you can also stay tuned via our Instagram, which is just @queernature. And then we will post updates on the website as that becomes more clear. But yeah, I just also wanted to kind of plant that seed of that we are drifting more toward the Northwest direction, and certainly would love to find ourselves in the Bay Area as well. So I hope we get a chance to share space.
Wonderful. Me too. Yeah, thank you. And thanks, folks, for listening to this episode of Bespoken Bones. I've been here with Pinar and So of Queer Nature. And if you have felt inspired by what you heard here, I would love to hear from you as well. You can be in touch with me through either bespokenbones.com or emancipating-sexuality.com. You can learn more about the work that I'm doing. Just want to hear from you. I want to hear your suggestions, your thoughts. Like, this was a lot in this interview. And I'm sure that some stuff got lit and stirred for you. So talk to me about it. I want to hear it. I'm Pavini Moray. I'll be back every full and new moon with more embodied goodness and ancestral wisdom.
Mírame, ahora soy más fuerte. Mírame.